Monsignor, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I'm very honored to be here in London with you. I hope you're not offended if we pray yet one more time before I begin to speak. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. We'll call on God the Holy Spirit to be with us. O heavenly ruler, comforter, Spirit of truth, who are everywhere present and fill all things. O treasury of blessing, giver of life, fire of God's love, Father of the poor, come. Come dwell within us, enlighten, guide, strengthen, defend, and console us. Cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. Mary, Mother of the Church, pray for us. I'm the president of the University of Mary in Bismarck, North Dakota, in the United States. We're a university of about 4,000 students, 5 of whom I think are from the United Kingdom. They are on our soccer team, which is what you call football. American football, I'm told, is rugby for girls. But I'm happy to be here with you. I was on Saturday at Leeds, Trinity University in Leeds, where I spoke at a conference. And then I think yesterday I came from Cork in Ireland. On Sunday I did a conference for the youth of the Diocese of Cork and Ross. And then here I am in London. I'm with you tonight, and then tomorrow I'm with a gathering of clergy and seminarians. Very grateful to be able to be here with you. Also to see my old friend, Father Mark Vickers, who is the parish priest at the Holy Ghost and St. Stephen's Parish here in London. And he and I went out to Eton and to Windsor Castle today, and so I was very happy as well for that experience. I tell you how happy I am because fundamentally I'm deeply embarrassed to be brought all the way over here to speak about a small essay that you could have read 3 times in the time that it took for me to fly overseas. It's just a very humble essay which came out in the year 2020. The University of Mary published it as an internal piece primarily for our own faculty and staff. We wanted to give a kind of vision for the way that the university was moving forward in what we think is a new apostolic age. What happened after that was a great surprise and a little bit of a scandal. The book began to sell at a very fast pace, such that we published it in May of 2020. By September, we were selling 150 copies every single day, online and out of our bookstore. I think since then it hasn't slowed down. Dioceses in the United States have bought thousands upon thousands of copies. One diocese did a study guide, which also is embarrassing because it's a 90-page book. And so it raises questions about literacy, I think, to have a study guide for a 90-page essay. And I understand that the Catholic Truth Society is distributing it here in England. It's being translated into German and into Polish. And I'm just very surprised by that, because we've never advertised it or taken out a single marketing piece for this book, and we didn't intend it to be something that would strike a nerve in the way that it did. We published, as Monsignor Armitage mentioned, a sequel to the book in November of this year, the 3rd week of November. We entitled it The Religion of the Day, as a description of what we think is a deeply religious age in which we live right now. And we published it the 3rd week in November, and I think it's sold 10,000 copies already. And so it's very perplexing to me in a certain sense, partly also because in both of the books, everything that we say has been said better and in more depth by those who have gone before us. And indeed, in the book From Christendom to Apostolic Mission, it's somewhat a recapitulation of the papal magisteriums of the last 60 years, from Pope St. John the 23rd all the way through to Pope Francis. But in any case, what I would do is give you just a sense for what we say in the text, and then the Catholic Truth Society has it for you if you'd like to pick up a copy and read it presented in a more systematic form. Then I'll give it tonight. But first, I wonder if you've ever come across any of the works of the American author from the deep south of our country, whose name is Walker Percy. Walker Percy was a convert to Catholicism, who was also a medical doctor turned journalist turned novelist. He won the Pulitzer Prize twice, the National Book Award. And in the middle of the 1980s, Walker Percy published a book called Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. It was kind of the era of the self-help movement. It was a time when bookstores, at least in my home country, were filled with whole sections of books on self-help. It was the heyday of television stars like Phil Donahue, and Oprah was just on the horizon. And in the midst of that, Walker Percy wrote this satirical book called Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. He begins the book with a quiz that you can take, a test, to see if you're lost in the cosmos. And if you're not lost in the cosmos, you don't have to read the rest of the book. The quiz takes the form of a series of thought experiments. One of the thought experiments that he poses is that you should imagine yourself to be a tourist in Greece. And so you go to Greece, and all of the circumstances of the tour that you're on are very pleasant. You have an air-conditioned motor coach, you have a good hotel with good food, you have a knowledgeable guide to take you around and make sure that you get to all of the places in the right time. And they take you to the Acropolis, of course, and you see the Parthenon. And you go into the Parthenon, and it's a massive bore. It's so boring. You notice that there is grass growing up from beneath the pavements. The portico is stained with acid rain. And anyway, the British have taken all of the interesting parts of it to the British Museum. And it's just boring. It looked better, frankly, in the brochure. And this raises a question. Why? Why should the Parthenon, one of the great founts of Western civilization, viewed under really pleasant conditions, be boring? Why? And then he says, imagine a different set of circumstances in a different viewing of the Parthenon. The whole city of Athens is under a Soviet assault, and you're a NATO soldier on a hill overlooking the city. You're behind sandbags. Your arms are propped up holding binoculars, and you're looking down on a city which is being showered by missiles. 500,000 Greeks are already dead. 2 missiles within your eyesight bracket the Parthenon. The next one will surely be a hit. You might be the last person alive who ever sees the Parthenon. And in that moment, the clouds clear, and a beam of sunlight comes down right on the portico. Are you bored now? Can you see the Parthenon? Well, of course you're not bored under those circumstances. Why not? Because it's a fundamental question of how one envisions or imagines one's life. Human beings are inveterate, meaning-seeking creatures. We cannot live unless our lives are undergirded by some sense of meaning or purpose, some narrative or some drama. The imaginative vision, and here when I'm speaking about imagination, I don't mean imaginary, bibbidi-bobbidi-boo. I mean the extraordinary capacity of the human mind to hold within ourselves the past and the present and the future, and to navigate the world in which we live. This imaginative capacity allows us to see ourselves. In Walker Percy's thought experiment, one has to choose between what it's like to live as a tourist or as a soldier. To live one's life as a tourist or as a soldier. And there is a fundamental and deep philosophical and social and human difference between those two realities. A soldier, of course, is a person who relies upon his fellow soldiers, who has a deep vocational call, a profound purpose, something to fight for. Remember that Chesterton said that a true soldier fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him. A soldier is someone with a patrimony to fight for, with something to defend, with a deep capacity for love and trust. And that's the way that we're meant to live our lives. This, by the way, is a question which I'm haunted by and occupied by all of the time in the work that I do with young people at the University of Mary. Because the culture would say something different to them, would give them a different kind of imaginative vision, would say to them that your life and the world is a neutral place, a field of opportunity, which is meant to be characterized in a relatively uneventful way. It's meant to go along according to plan. You're meant to be able to have a good job and a good family, good friends, interesting people to work with, interesting holidays and vacations, and pictures of your food on Instagram. And that's the meaning of life. But of course, that's massively boring. And that imaginative vision doesn't give any life. Pope Benedict XVI reminded us that we weren't made for such comfort. No, we were made for greatness, and life is meant to be an epic adventure. And those of us who are followers of the gospel feel that deep within our bones. And of course, we know that it's not enough simply to follow the gospel. We need to evangelize as well. We need to spread the gospel. And how are we to do that? And that brings us to the quote which Mgr Armitage already has referenced, which stands at the very beginning of this small, humble essay, From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. It comes actually from the Aparecida document. In 2007, the bishops of Latin America met at an enormous Marian shrine in Brazil called Aparecida. And they had deliberations about what it meant in our day to evangelize and the task which was before them. And the document which arose out of this gathering of bishops was called the Aparecida document, the primary author of which was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who of course is now Pope Francis. And the document said, ours is not an age of change, but a change of the ages. Ours is not an age of change, but a change of the ages. And the Holy Father has repeated this quote often, especially in the early days of his papacy. We don't find ourselves in an age of change, we find ourselves in a change of age. What does that mean? It means that there are sometimes some moments in human history when you can draw a bright line between everything that went before and everything that will come after. And we are living in such a time. And if we don't think that we're living in such a time, we will make terrible strategic mistakes in the way that we live our faith and in the way that we attempt to spread our faith, in the way that we evangelize. We are living in a change of age. So, of course, what comes to mind is the teachings of the popes over the past 60 years. Think, for instance, of Pope St. Paul VI, who as early as Evangelii Nunciandi, was talking about Europe as having become, in his lifetime, mission territory again. That Europe had become mission territory again. Pope St. John Paul II spoke often about the new evangelization. He made it a kind of watchword. Pope Benedict XVI established a dicastery at the Vatican specifically dedicated to the new evangelization, and Pope Francis, of course, has also spoken about this question. The phrase new evangelization, as you probably know, came from a speech that Pope St. John Paul II had given in May of 1983 to that same group, to CELAM, the same Aparecida group, the bishops of Latin America. In it, he talked about the new evangelization, using the phrase, I think, for the first time. What was new about it? He said that what would be new about it is that it would be, well, first of all, it's important to establish this. The new evangelization is the old evangelization. It's the proclamation of the Lordship of Jesus Christ. But it's new in its methods, he said, its ardor and its expressions. Its method, its ardor, and its expression would be different. That it would be, as Pope St. John the 23rd had said at the calling of the Second Vatican Council, Gaudet Mater Ecclesia, when he stood over the tomb of St. Peter and convened the Second Vatican Council, he said that the faith, the proclamation of the faith, which is unchanging, was to be made more efficacious by the work of the Council. So new in method, expression, and ardor. But I would add one thing. It's also new in its circumstances. That's what the change of ages is about. So what are some, there are many implications to this, but here are a few of them. First of all, we're living in the first ever society in history which once was deeply Christian, but which over the course of a process, taking probably the last 300 years, has systematically and thoroughly rid itself of its Christian basis. There has never before, in the way that we have it now, been a post-Christian society. This makes evangelization very difficult because it's difficult from, in other words, we're not trying to evangelize pagans, people who have never been Christian before. Remember, C.S. Lewis said when he looked at a pagan, he just saw a person who could be a Christian. We're not evangelizing pagans, we're evangelizing people who are in the grip of apostasy, who once were Christian, but who have left, and indeed who think that they've heard the gospel, they've considered it, and it has nothing at all to offer them. Again, Lewis talked about it as the difference between winning the heart of a young maiden who's never been in love before and winning the heart of a cynical divorced person back to a prior bond, which is a more complicated and difficult task. Our task in the age in which we live is the second task. And it's made more complicated by the fact that a lot of people who call themselves Christian, even now, really fundamentally in their deepest convictions have left Christianity behind and believe in a quite different religion. So that's one difference in circumstance. Another one would be that in the last century or so, we've had a kind of technological revolution which has altered just about every aspect of the way that people live. And I'm not talking here about the most obvious changes, the difference between horses and motor cars, or the difference between candles and hearths versus electric lighting and central heating. The technological progress which has happened over the course of the last century has altered humanity's conception of itself, of the natural world, of family, of work, such that the mental and emotional furniture of most people has been completely rearranged. Our ways of thinking and our patterns of life are more different than people who lived 100 years ago than they would have been for people who lived 100 years ago with people who lived at the time of Christ. That's how much things have changed, and that's a new set of circumstances. Did I say that clearly enough? I know that English people are sticklers for using language rightly. So people who lived in the time of Jesus and people who lived 100 years ago would be more similar in their ways of thinking and manner of life than we are with either of them. And that's a difference. And lastly, I'll say something which I think is probably quite controversial. When we look out at the wounds of our time, when we consider the landscape in which we live, especially those of us who are serious believers and who sometimes are deeply grieved and saddened by the world in which we live, when we do that, what we see, if we look clearly, is that the wounds of our time are primarily intellectual wounds. That can be obfuscated or unclear because so many of the wounds of our time have an obvious moral effect or a moral character. But if you look more carefully, you see that there's an intellectual problem at hand. Every civilization in the history of the world has struggled with sexual excess and tried to find a way to put a handle or a rein upon the human sexual drive. It has been left to our age to come up with a sophisticated justification for sexual indulgence from an intellectual perspective. Every society has been sorely tempted to treat in a savage fashion those young among them who were inconvenient. It's been left to our age to justify the slaughter of innocents, not simply to say that it's something which could be tolerated, but to think about it as something good in the quest for personal autonomy and freedom. That's new. Likewise, every age in human history has been tempted to pride in overreaching. It's been left to our age to come up with technologies and mindsets which are intent upon rebuilding the human person from the ground up. These are intellectual wounds, and they require an intellectual response. And here, even though I work at a university and serve a university, I don't mean here an academic response. I mean an intellectual response which is similar to the intellectual activity of the early church. If you look at the pages of the Acts of the Apostles, you see that there was a profound conversion of mind which took hold after the ascension of Jesus and the coming of the Holy Spirit. Here were men and women who had been so converted in mind that they were willing to put everything on the line, that they had a completely different vision of reality, which they were willing to live out in the midst of all of its ramifications. That kind of intellectual clarity is required of Christians in our own time, in this new era. To say something more, I think it's useful for us to talk a little bit about the role of a ruling imaginative vision in human societies. So I said a little bit at the very beginning about how I'm always thinking when I'm working with young people about the imaginative vision of their life that they're being given, the difference between being a soldier and a tourist. In the same way, whole civilizations and cultures are founded upon a ruling imaginative vision because we are, as human beings, social animals and inveterate meaning-seeking creatures. We cannot live without a story, without a common dream, without something to strive for together. So every civilization, every culture has what we would call a ruling imaginative vision. This is a vision of human life and the human drama, which includes categories of success and failure, what it means to be a good person, governmental and legal and moral norms. Usually the imaginative vision of a culture or society is grounded in or anchored in a religion which probes the deepest questions, but it's not simply a religious question. It's a whole question of the fundamental foundation of the culture. In a vigorous civilization, the ruling imaginative vision is a settled question that just about all of the population, the whole of the civilization, all the people, all the members of it have assumed this vision deep within them. Now, that doesn't mean that all of them can explain it or understand the principles behind it or expound upon or defend the principles behind it. It simply means that it's become part of the interior architecture within their minds. And so in a vigorous culture, that ruling imaginative vision has deeply penetrated the culture. If that ruling imaginative vision comes to be seriously challenged, then the culture or the civilization goes into crisis, and it remains in crisis either until that ruling imaginative vision reasserts itself or until another vision comes and takes its place. Good. And you can tell a ruling imaginative vision partly by the things that you don't have to argue for, by the things which are taken for granted. Think about, for instance, the question of slavery in the world in which we live today, right? Because of the work of and the labors of people like William Wilberforce here or Abraham Lincoln, because of the work of people over the course of long generations, people don't argue anymore about whether or not we should have slavery, whether there might be some economic advantage to it. People who advocate for slavery aren't argued with, they're run out of the room, run out of the building, because there's a deep conviction, which is at the heart of our ruling imaginative vision, that slavery is simply not permissible. Now, of course, we're living in a time in which a lot of things which used to occupy that same category, that weren't seriously argued about, things like abortion or gay marriage, these things now are assumed in a very different way. There's been a civilization or a cultural shift. And that represents a little bit of the shift that I'm talking about in a larger sense. So I'll come to that now. There is a ruling imaginative vision which could be called a Christendom vision, or a Christendom narrative, or a Christendom culture, okay? So in a Christendom situation, or in a Christendom culture, the civilization or the culture has taken its moral order and its account of the human drama from the gospel of Jesus Christ, from Christianity and all of its ramifications. That's what it arrives at. That's very different. Oftentimes the word Christendom is used to describe a kind of medieval situation like England in the Middle Ages, which indicated a particular relationship between the crown and the church. But I'm not talking about it in that way. I'm talking about it in this civilizational way, in this question of a ruling imaginative vision. When the ruling imaginative vision of a culture is fundamentally Christian, formed by and undergirded by the gospel, then you have a Christendom culture. At the time when Christianity first arose, God's people, Israel, were surrounded by another civilization which had a very potent ruling imaginative vision of its own. That was the Greco-Roman world. And these were sophisticated and amazing people who had built one of the greatest civilizations, maybe the greatest in the history of humanity. And so for the first 300 years or so, the Christians had to make their way, because they had a very different vision of the human person and God and reality and salvation and the afterlife than the culture around them. They had different moral norms. They had to make their way upstream with great effort and with the shedding of much blood against a ruling imaginative vision which was opposed to their vision. That was the first apostolic age. That was the early age of the martyrs. Then in the 4th century, Christianity came to challenge and eventually overcome the Greco-Roman vision of the world, incorporating certain aspects of that vision into its own teaching and educational method, even a little bit into aspects of its vocabulary. So from that time, and of course one of the key moments of that would have been the Edict of Milan, Constantine's edict legalizing Christianity in 313. Life in the West, since then, in a broad sense here, I know that the historians present could niggle with me on this, but in a broad sense, life in the West since then has been a series of Christendom cultures. And that doesn't mean that in these long ages of Christendom that the majority of people were deeply devout Christians. It meant that their vision of the world, their assumed vision deep within, had a Christian basis to it. And so in the saints of Christendom, when we think about the saints who preached and worked and served and suffered during those long ages of Christendom, constantly were reminding us that there's a necessity to wake people up, to jostle them from their complacency. And so here's an example, and I think it proves the point. If you think of some of the great preachers of Christendom, people like Bernardino of Siena, or Savonarola, or John Wesley, when you think of them going from town to town, they could preach, and the effectiveness of their preaching was such that whole towns would convert en masse. Why? Because latent within their hearers already was the Christian vision of the world. It simply needed to be woken up, it needed to be stirred, and then it came into full color, which was no small feat. But that's what happens in the long ages of Christendom. What I would contend now is that as a result of many different complicated factors, in a way which Pope St. I'm very sorry. in a way that John Henry Newman, who was not a pope at all, in a way that John Henry Newman predicted a long time ago, our civilization has lost its Christian basis, is no longer in any meaningful sense a Christendom culture, and we find ourselves actually in a new apostolic age, Now, we spend a lot of time, I think, sort of wringing our hands and fretting about this because we're worried about what it means for us, what it means for our children and grandchildren, what it means for our civilization. But it's important for us to remember that the church understands how to move in different times. The church knows how to operate in a Christendom mode, in a mode of the building of civilization and the maintaining of great structures and institutions and of the epic sweeping narrative of the gospel. The church knows how to operate in a Christendom mode. The church also knows and has experience operating in an apostolic mode, which is a different way of acting and interacting with the society or with the culture. And not just in the first apostolic age, not just in those first 300 years, the church always knew how to operate in an apostolic mode in terms of its mission activities. So for instance, everybody knew that you didn't do things exactly the same in Paris as you would in Papua New Guinea. The mission territory, mission work has always been undertaken in an apostolic mode. The thing is here, as Paul VI reminds us, the whole of the civilization has become missionary territory. It is very important for us to recognize this. So when we put together this little essay, it was just to say to everybody at the University of Mary, a small Catholic university on the windswept prairies in the middle of North Dakota, what we call flyover territory, a blank space on the nation's consciousness, among farmers and cows. We just wanted to say, hey, we need to not miss this moment. If we operate the university in a Christendom mode, if we allocate our resources and plan strategically and make decisions in a Christendom way, when the culture has changed all around us and under our feet, we will squander what God is doing right now. We will miss the point in the drama of our lives and our calling, and we will not serve well in the way which we're called to serve. But if we shift to an apostolic mode, it will affect everything. It will involve particular sacrifices and decisions which might be difficult, but we will then be able to engage and spread the gospel and evangelize in a very particular way. It wasn't about Britain, and I don't know about how to evangelize Britain, and so you came here kind of on a false pretense. I hope you know how to do it, but I know something about how to evangelize a university filled with students from all over the United States and all over the world, including 5 Britons. That's what I know about, and that's what I'm happy to help you with. Now, when I was at Leeds Trinity University, somebody asked me a question which hurt, which was mean. No, it wasn't mean-spirited. It just bothered me a little bit because the person said, isn't Christendom good? Don't you like Christendom? Christendom was good. And he had misunderstood because I think Christendom is good too. I think it's amazing. And so what I'd like to do is just say a word about the advantages and disadvantages of living in a Christendom time or in an apostolic time, because there are advantages and disadvantages to both. And I see that we're running a little short on time, and so I will abbreviate, but there's a little book which has all of this in a lot more detail, and I don't even think it's very expensive. And I don't get any of the profits, and it's for your Catholic Truth Society, and so you can pick it up if you're dissatisfied with what I've said. And if you're dissatisfied with the extent to which I've said things, if you're dissatisfied with the content of what I've said, write your own book. That's what I say about that. So in shorthand, there are tremendous advantages to a Christendom age, tremendous advantages. Christians in a Christendom time, have a profound creative spirit about them. They're civilizational in their mindset. When Christendom takes hold in the heart and the mind of a people, they are great builders. Everything is suffused with the sweetness of the gospel in really marvelous and mysterious and wonderful ways. Education and law and government, art, architecture, literature, all of these things are touched by that. It's a marvelous thing, for instance, to think about the Christianization of Europe and how in the wake of that, great cathedrals began to arise mysteriously, along with hospitals and orphanages and schools, and ultimately universities. The whole idea of a university arose out of Christian civilization. Another advantage of a Christendom time is that you can rely upon the wider culture for the firm founding of families. In a Christendom time, and I'll say something about this in just a moment, in a Christendom time, parents can rely upon the ambient culture to help them to raise their children and to keep the faith and to deepen the faith, and that's a great advantage as well. There's a sweetness and a justice among many failures which take root or take hold in a Christendom time. Institutions become deep and well-founded and in many ways very effective for their purposes in a Christendom time because Christians are geniuses at the founding and running of institutions. And so all of those are advantages of Christendom. And there are many others. To my friend in Leeds who was so critical and thought that I hated Christendom, I love Christendom, and I think that there are many advantages. There are also disadvantages. And so let me say something about those. A Christendom time can become a time in which things can go on autopilot, in which there can be a deep lukewarmness, in which people can become, because they think that they've heard the gospel, they can lose their zeal or their clarity of purpose. Hypocrisy is the great sin of a Christendom time. Hypocrisy defined as pretending to care more about God and truth than you really do. That is one of the disadvantages of Christendom. In a time of Christendom, hypocrisy can make its way also into the clergy. And so because you can gain power or influence or wealth by being associated with the church, some bad apples can insinuate themselves and can worm their way right in. Now I know that's very bad use of language, right? All mixing of metaphors. Bad apples can worm their way into the heart of the church. I'm looking to get thrown out of this country as soon as possible. So they can worm their way right into the heart of the church, and a lot of corruption can happen. This is something which you see all through the history of Christendom in various ways. And a false dichotomy can begin to arise between those who really, really believe and practice the faith and the majority of people. It can manifest itself, for instance, in a desire among those who really want to give it all for the Lord to join a religious order or something, which was called in Christendom times leaving the world, which is a strange phrase because according to the gospel, we're all supposed to leave the world. And, you know, you've heard, I think, the story of the cardinal who was picked up at the airport in Rome. Oh, that taxi driver, he was so excited to have a cardinal in the back of his taxi cab. And the cardinal became concerned for his safety because the taxi driver was so excited that he was turning around and talking. You know, the Italians talk with their hands. And so it became a very dangerous situation, and the taxi driver kept saying, "Oh, sono cattolico, I'm a Catholic. I love having a cardinal in I'm such a faithful Catholic. I'm a big Catholic. I love the church. Oh, eminenza, eminenza, eminenza." And finally, the cardinal, who really was quite concerned for his life, said, "How very nice and wonderful that you love the faith so much. What parish do you go to?" And in order to give a proper answer, the taxi cab driver needed to pull over to the side of the road and use both of his hands and his whole upper torso to give this answer. And he said, "Eminenza Ho detto che sono cattolico, non sono fanatico. Your Eminence, I told you I'm a Catholic. I'm not a fanatic. I don't go to Mass on Sunday. My, my Italian teacher in Rome one time told me, she said to me, my father, she said, is cattolicissimo. And I said, cosa significa? What does that mean, cattolicissimo, which means like super Catholic or uber Catholic? And she said, when he enters a church, he takes holy water and makes the sign of the cross. Cattolicissimo. And so this is the kind of thing which can happen in a Christendom time. People can become so lukewarm, and there's a division which happens in the role of the laity, for instance, and the responsibility of the regular Christian man and woman to spread the gospel and to witness to the gospel can be greatly diminished. There are also advantages and disadvantages to living in an apostolic time. So advantages of living in an apostolic time, because one has to suffer somewhat for the faith, because it's not easy, because you're swimming upstream, because there's a particular amount of resistance in the culture all around you to the gospel, it means that in general there's less hypocrisy. Christianity in such a time begins to attract the most high-hearted, the best of the people, those who want to give it all, those who are willing to make serious sacrifices. Along with that comes a sense for the great gripping, embracing adventure of following Jesus. The transformative power of the gospel becomes more clear in such a time. That's an advantage. It's an advantage, a strange advantage, but one is given the possibility of suffering for the faith, which from the very beginning was considered to be a great honor and privilege. You know the story, don't you, of a group of believers in Soviet Russia, Christians who used to meet in a barn to pray. And one night when they were meeting there praying in secret, the doors burst open and soldiers came in and said, "We've been sent here to execute you because your activity here is illegal. But we know that there are some of you who are here for sincere reasons and others who are here because of familial pressure, because you're not really sincere. And so we would ask that anyone who wishes to leave, leave. If you are not a sincere Christian, you can leave, but otherwise stay and face your fate." And some people did leave, but the majority did not. And when they left, the doors were closed and the soldiers put down their arms and said, "We're Christians too, and we've come to pray with you, but you can't be too careful." This is the kind of purification which happens in apostolic time. And in a strange, difficult, but beautiful way, it's a great blessing. It's a great blessing. There are also disadvantages of living in an apostolic time. I said the key sin in a Christendom time is hypocrisy, pretending to care more about God and truth than you really do. The sin in an apostolic time is not hypocrisy. There's less hypocrisy. The sin in an apostolic time is cowardice, pretending to care less about God and truth than you really do. In an apostolic time, institutions are much harder to found and maintain. I know this from experience. Even though, in a certain sense, I grew up in the last gasp of Christendom, and North Dakota is much less secular than most places of the post-Christian world, it's still true. To build and to maintain an institution, to keep a university Catholic, fully and seriously Catholic in an apostolic time is very difficult, and it comes with many challenges. Because the ambient culture is sometimes hostile to faith, there will very often be material advantages to making peace with the surrounding culture. And so there's great apostasy that happens because people just don't have the inner strength to be able to deal with it. Another great disadvantage of an apostolic time is that it's hard to raise children. I cannot tell you how many people have come up to me in the course of my priesthood. I've been a priest about 21 years now. And so many people have come up to me brokenhearted, devastated, and they say things to me like this: Father, when my wife and I were growing up, my parents taught us how to pray. They sent us to Catholic school. They got us the sacraments, and we kept the faith. Maybe we wandered a little bit when we went to university, but we came back. We kept the faith. We've done the same thing that they did. We did the same thing that they did for our children. We sent them to Catholic schools at great sacrifice. We raised them in the faith. We taught them how to pray. We got them their sacraments. And they've all left the practice of their faith. And our grandchildren, they're not even baptized. What did we do wrong? And people carry deep shame around with them because of this, not realizing that they're not simply responsible for that, because the whole culture has shifted under their feet. My parents raised 8 children on a small dairy farm 2 miles north of Hazleton, North Dakota, which is a town of 200 people. In that town, my mom and dad, my teachers at school, in a state school, not in a Catholic school, my teachers at school, the Catholic priest and the Lutheran minister were all on the same team. All of them were at it together. They were saying something subconsciously like, we've got a town full of kids. We've got 20 years, 18 years, maybe before they fly the coop, before they leave the roost. And we're going to make them Christians. So they linked arms and they did it together. My younger brother Tom, who's number 4 of the 8, is raising his 7 children on the same farm a couple of decades later. And the work that his wife and he have to do is much, much more difficult. They have to be much more intentional about the raising of their children than my parents had to be, because they don't have any help from the culture. And so it's much, much more difficult to raise children. And I could go on and on with advantages and disadvantages of both a Christendom time and an apostolic time. But none of that in the end matters to a certain extent, in that we don't choose the times in which we live. Those are chosen for us by God, and God equips us with all the grace and all the strength and all the ingenuity and all the energy necessary for us to fulfill our mission in our time and space. I tell our students at the University of Mary all the time, there's no room for nostalgia in the Christian life, none. We should never wish that we were born in a different age. We were born in the age in which we were born. Remember in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo says to Gandalf at a certain point, I wish none of this had ever happened. I wish the ring had never come to me. And Gandalf says, so do all who live to see such times, but that's not for them to decide. The only thing for them to decide is what to do with the times that they've been given. And this is true for us as well. The point of the matter, of course, is that we can make a very serious strategic error by operating in a Christendom mode when the age is apostolic. This is the fundamental error which we can be tempted. We can get ourselves into a mindset where it's all business as usual, and we're hiding our head in the sand, and we're not taking stock of the times in which we live, and when the fall comes, it will be catastrophic. And you can see that, just to pick on people all around here who are not England, you can see that in some of the most Catholic places, not simply in the world a couple of generations ago, not simply in the world, but maybe in the history of the world, places which were thoroughly, thoroughly Catholic, like Belgium, Ireland, Spain, Quebec. In those places, the church operated in a Christendom mode largely, as everything was shifting under their feet. Go to Quebec today. I went there once to Montreal. I drove past their seminary, which used to be, I think, the largest seminary in the world, 800 beds. There were 8 seminarians at the time I drove past, and the place is closed now. There was a time when in Quebec, I think 1 in 10 women was a member of a religious order. Now all of the orders are gone, dried up. There's almost nothing left. Everything has collapsed. That's because of a strategic error in the work of evangelization. And so there are various strategies which we can adopt to make sure that we don't make these errors, and we lay them out very simply in that little essay. Things like assuming an apostolic mindset, which is a mindset of abundance, not of scarcity, because God is God and He's not worried. And his are the cattle on 1,000 hills, the Psalms tell us. And so after the ascension, when the apostles were looking around at each other, they had nothing. They had no institutions, they had no seminaries, they had no universities, they had no parishes, they had nothing. But they weren't afraid. They weren't wringing their hands or saying, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Why? Because their master had just gone up to the sky and was the master of the sky. And so they set off and they converted the world by their witness. Not being trapped by social analysis. We hear all the time about how the perceived dissonance between science and religion is just too much for our young people, and they're all leaving at the average age of 13. That might be true from a sociological perspective, but sociology is not the future. It's just a science which helps us in some way to understand what might be going on right now. We can never know what the Holy Spirit is going to be up to. Look at post-revolutionary France. It looked like the church was on its last legs when the dust settled after the revolution. And yet the 19th century was one of the most amazing times for Catholicism in the whole country. Lots of generative power, because the gospel has that power and the church has that power, this ever-creative sense of regeneration and renewal. And that's what we're meant to be a part of. There are strategies which have to do with rethinking priestly life and how that works, expecting cultural influence to be exercised primarily by impressive witness, because we don't have cultural influence in politics anymore. And so we still have the possibility of dazzling those in the world around us by our sense of mission, by our willingness to love each other and care for the poor, to care for the poor and to care for those who are hurting in the midst of a culture in which everything is permitted and nothing is forgiven, to be men and women of mercy. This is greatly beneficial and deeply needed. We have to allocate resources in a particular way. But all of these are strategies, they're not tactics. In America, when I talk about this, everybody wants to say, okay, how do we apply this to the work of Catholic medical doctors? You know, because Americans, we're all pragmatists. We talk about the cash value of ideas. I know that you're much more high-minded than my countrymen and would never ask me such a question. All we offer in the essay are strategies, not tactics, not a blueprint, not a program. You have to do that yourself. And that, in fact, is the creativity that we're called to. We've been gifted with that. There's a charism in each of you to know how best to spread the gospel in your own time and in your own place. And in the midst of it all, of course, this is one of the other disadvantages of an apostolic time, which I forgot to say. There's a temptation for us to circle the wagons, to come in out from the wind and huddle together and say, to hell with the world. Let them just go to Hades, and we're just going to preserve our little flame here. We can adopt a rigorous attitude, which has never been the Christian way. We have common concerns with the whole of humanity. And it's extraordinarily important, not simply for ourselves and our own salvation, but for the salvation of the world, because this generation of Catholics is responsible for this generation of people, as it's always been. We have a responsibility to find new ways to spread the gospel. And what we say at the very end of the essay is that the key task of our time is to articulate the Christian imaginative vision in a more powerful fashion, in an epic fashion. Because here's the thing. The world, in the sequel to the Christendom book and Religion of the Day, what we try and do is spell out the dogmas and the commitments and the attitudes and the mindset of the new religion, which has risen up and replaced Christianity, which is a parasitical religion upon Christianity, which relies upon our faith for much of its dramatic power. Fine. But in the end, that vision is super boring. And people know it. It starts with this kind of revolutionary call to throw off the shackles of oppression from ancient dark ages. But what it ends in is shop till you drop. It ends in a kind of materialist consumerism, which is fundamentally unsatisfying. And the young people that I serve are done with it. They're bored out of their minds by it. They want an epic adventure. They want something to give their lives to. And we've got it. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the most exciting, most thrilling, most heart-rending and heart-stopping story that's ever been told, with the wickedest of villains and the most magnificent and noble of heroes. And it's our story. And people are deeply desperate for it. This is Chesterton again, right? That when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And so people are hungry. Look at the popularity of epic stories of good and evil that have cropped up all around us. Look at the popularity of the Star Wars trilogy, or Marvel comics, or Game of Thrones, or even Christian stories like The Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia. People love this kind of thing. They're arrested by it because they want to be able to locate their lives within the midst of an epic story. We have to get better and find better ways to tell the epic story. The group of us who worked together on these two little essays, we put together a little website called Prime Matters. This is not a promotional thing. It's simply to say this. On Prime Matters, we published an audio project kind of podcast thing called The Christian Mythic Narrative. And all we've done there is a very simple thing. We've taken the whole story from before creation and before the fall of the angels all the way up to the present day, and we've told it in little 7-minute or 6-minute or 5-minute or 8-minute segments, the telling of the story of salvation from an epic perspective. We show that. I play it for our students at the University of Mary. Their minds are blown by it because it's like it's a story that they've never heard before. We need to find ways to communicate the gospel to people who think they've heard it before, these cynical divorcees, but actually have never heard it in all of its power and in all of its grandeur. We need to devise new ways to do that. We've tried to do it in this epic sense with the Christian mythic narrative, but you can do it too in your own ways, to find ways so that people can discover the gospel again for the first time, which is deeply important. Anyway, the times in which we live are tremendously exciting. I'm convinced, I don't know if you are, that when we die, the saints will run up to us if we make it to heaven. I hope to. After a long stay in purgatory, all of us, I hope, will arrive in paradise, and the saints will run up to us and say, tell us about those times. Tell us what it was like to be alive then, in those epic times, what Mgr Armitage said, in the third springtime of Britain, in that great change of the ages in which you lived. What was it like to believe then, to practice your faith, to witness to it, to suffer for it? You're the heroes. Do you know that? That's what's waiting for us if we stand firm. Thanks, everybody. Great to be with you tonight.